There comes a time, whether at 30, 40, or 49, when the pursuit of external validation begins to lose its color. The titles, the wealth, the applause, they ring hollow if the man who receives them has never met his true self. There is a part of every man that he does not wish to see. It hides behind polite words, behind the smile worn in meetings, behind the confidence shown in public. It is a whisper in the dead of night, a weight felt when silence settles. This hidden realm of the psyche, this unclaimed part of the soul, is what we call the shadow. It is made up of all the things a man does not want to be but is, and until a man faces it truly, honestly, and without flinching, he remains a stranger to himself. The shadow is not evil in itself, it is merely unknown. But what is unknown within us gains power. The longer it remains repressed, the more fiercely it takes its toll. You see it in the man who explodes in rage at trivial matters, who sabotages his own relationships, who fears intimacy yet yearns for it. He believes these are accidents or bad luck, but they are not. They are the expressions of a part of himself he refuses to acknowledge. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It adapts. It becomes passive aggression, jealousy, shame, impulsivity. It speaks in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the faces of those we irrationally despise. When a man turns 40 or 50, life begins to turn inward. The outward climb, career, status, conquest, can no longer distract him from the inner void. It is at this hour that the shadow demands recognition. Midlife is not a crisis of age, but a confrontation with the self. One begins to wonder, why do I feel empty despite having everything I thought I wanted? Why do my habits betray me? Why do I fear stillness? These are not weaknesses, these are signals. The psyche is calling you inward, not to shame you, but to complete you. To face the shadow is not to become immoral, violent, or self-destructive. It is to acknowledge that those capacities exist within you as they do in all men. The man who believes he is purely virtuous is the most dangerous, for he will unconsciously enact his shadow on others, judging, controlling, blaming, hating, while denying the very qualities he condemns. True morality begins when a man admits what he is capable of and chooses a higher path consciously, not blindly. You cannot master what you will not admit exists. This confrontation is not abstract, it is lived. It happens in the discomfort of conflict, in the pain of loss, in the sting of criticism. When someone provokes anger in you, look closely. What have they touched in you that is unresolved? What part of your shadow have they awakened? The world acts as a mirror, showing us the parts of ourselves we try hardest to hide, and yet these are the very parts most in need of healing. It is not enough to merely observe the shadow, you must engage with it. Write down your hidden thoughts without censoring, reflect on your childhood wounds, question your compulsions, sit with your envy, your fear, your rage, not to feed them but to understand them. Most of the shadow is built in childhood, when we learned that certain feelings were not acceptable. So we buried them. But the child who was told not to cry, not to shout, not to question, did not stop feeling. He simply learned to hide, and what is hidden festers. When you explore your darkness with courage, something strange happens. You do not become worse, you become deeper, more human, more whole. You become less reactive, less judgmental, more grounded. You begin to recognize your shared humanity with others. You develop compassion, not just for their suffering, but for your own. And in this compassion, transformation begins. The shadow also contains light. Not all that is hidden is ugly. Often it contains your suppressed creativity, your lost joy, your abandoned dreams. Many men exile not only their shame, but their brilliance. They were told they were too much, too sensitive, too different, and so they buried their fire. To face the shadow is also to recover these treasures. You must dig through the dirt of your pain to find the gold of your potential. This work is not done overnight. It is a lifelong conversation with the self, It is messy, non-linear, and humbling, but it is sacred. It is the threshold every man must cross if he wishes not merely to survive, but to awaken. You do not need to become perfect. You only need to become honest. The man who knows his shadow walks with humility. He is less swayed by praise or insult, for he knows who he is beneath both. He no longer projects his wounds onto others, because he has claimed them as his own. So the question is not whether you have a shadow. You do. The question is, will you face it, or will you let it rule you from the dark? The choice is yours. But know this: those who walk into their darkness with open eyes emerge not as victims, not as monsters, but as men. Real men, whole men, not divided against themselves, but integrated, balanced, alive. There exists within every man a quiet voice that speaks not in words, but in impressions, feelings, symbols, and sudden clarity. It does not demand, does not argue, does not clamor for attention the way the world does. It waits patiently beneath the noise of obligation, routine, and ambition. It is the inner voice intuition, soul, or what some call the self, that deeper, wiser aspect of one's being that knows long before the intellect understands. To honor this voice is not merely a spiritual idea. It is a psychological necessity for any man who wishes to live in alignment with who he truly is. From an early age, most boys are taught to override their inner guidance. Logic is praised, obedience is rewarded, rationality is treated as supreme, intuition is dismissed as foolish or weak, and so, over time, the internal compass becomes muffled. A boy who once acted instinctively with spontaneity and natural emotion becomes a man who checks every decision against societal expectations. He wears masks, fulfills roles, and excels outwardly, but often drifts inwardly. Something feels off, but he cannot name it. This disconnection from the inner voice is subtle but dangerous. It leads not to catastrophe all at once, but to a quiet erosion of authenticity. The inner voice is not always convenient. It will ask things of you that disrupt your plans. It may call you to leave a job that is killing your spirit, to end a relationship that no longer honors your growth, or to begin something uncertain but deeply meaningful. It does not calculate risks in numbers. It senses what your soul can no longer carry. Often it first emerges as unease, restlessness, or a persistent question you can't shake. Many ignore this whisper, believing it to be irrational or premature. But over time, what was once a whisper becomes a weight, and eventually the weight becomes suffering. In dreams, the inner voice often speaks more clearly than in waking life. Symbols, archetypes, and scenarios play out in ways that bypass the defenses of the conscious mind. The man who pays attention to his dreams begins to see what his waking mind avoids. Perhaps he dreams of a house with hidden rooms, representing unexplored aspects of his psyche, or of running from a shadowy figure, a representation of some truth he refuses to confront. These are not meaningless images. They are messages encoded in the language of the soul. To dismiss them is to ignore a sacred communication from the depths of your being. Listening to the inner voice requires the development of inner stillness. In a world that rewards speed, productivity, and noise, the man who pauses to reflect is seen as wasting time. But in truth, silence is where the inner voice grows loudest. In the space between tasks, in the moments before sleep, in walks without a destination. This is where the self speaks. To honor it is to give it room to exist. It is to stop filling every moment with distraction and allow discomfort to surface, for in that discomfort lies truth. The inner voice also reveals the difference between want and need. Society teaches men to want power, success, dominance, and wealth, but the inner voice may point towards something simpler: peace, love, purpose, connection, integrity. These things are rarely celebrated, but they are vital. The man who follows only his outer desires may achieve greatness in the world and yet feel like a stranger to himself. The man who honors his inner truth may walk a quieter path, but one that nourishes him. To honor the inner voice is not to act impulsively or irrationally. It is to create a relationship with that deeper knowing, to listen, to question, and to trust over time. There will be moments when the inner voice seems to contradict logic. At such times it is wise not to dismiss it, but to inquire what deeper truth is being revealed. Is there a value, a principle, a longing being ignored? The intellect is a powerful tool, but it cannot substitute for wisdom. Wisdom arises when the head bows to the heart. Fear is the great silencer of the inner voice. The man afraid to disappoint others, afraid to fail, afraid to step outside of convention, will not hear the self clearly. His inner voice will be drowned by the expectations of family, culture, peers. And yet the irony is that true freedom comes not from defying others for its own sake, but from obeying the quiet command of the soul. There is no formula, no checklist, no one size fits all method. Each man's voice is unique, and it speaks only to him. To compare it to another's is to miss the point entirely. When a man begins to honor his inner voice, his life does not necessarily become easier, but it does become real. He may still face hardship, uncertainty, and loss, but now his suffering has meaning because it is chosen. It is part of a deeper unfolding. He no longer moves through life as a passenger, but as a participant in his own becoming. The path may be narrow, even lonely at times, but it is his, and that, more than anything else, gives life its dignity. Men who live from the outside in become hollow. Men who live from the inside out become whole. To honor the inner voice is to begin the long journey home, not toward comfort, but toward truth. And in that truth one discovers not only who he is, but who he was always meant to be. Every man wears a mask, not one made of cloth or leather, but one forged from expectations, survival, and necessity. From early childhood, a boy learns what earns him approval, what invites affection, and what provokes punishment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he begins to form a version of himself suited to the world's gaze. He becomes the good student, the tough one, the reliable one, the achiever, the caretaker, the rebel. This mask, this socially acceptable identity, becomes what psychology calls the persona. It is not false, necessarily. It may reflect aspects of the true self, but it is incomplete. And when a man believes the persona to be the whole truth of who he is, he becomes a prisoner of his own image. The persona serves a purpose. In order to function in society, we must adapt. We cannot share every thought, express every emotion, or act on every impulse. The persona acts as a kind of bridge between the self and the collective. It allows us to belong, to communicate, to navigate, but problems arise when the persona is no longer a tool but an identity. When the man forgets that there is something behind the mask, he begins to confuse performance with presence. He becomes what others want him to be, even at the cost of what he truly is. To detach from the persona is not to abandon one's social role, nor to become erratic or rebellious for the sake of freedom. It is to recognize first that the mask exists. It is to observe how often your actions are rooted not in desire, but in duty, how often your words are tailored not to express truth, but to preserve image. How many decisions are made not from the soul, but from the need to maintain a certain impression? The persona is seductive. It rewards you with praise. It can open doors, but it also has a price. The more tightly you cling to it, the more distant you become from the deeper self that watches silently from within. There is suffering in maintaining a persona that no longer fits. Many men, by the time they reach midlife, experience a subtle form of grief or numbness. They have succeeded in their roles. They are fathers, professionals, leaders, but they feel unreal, as though they are watching their life unfold from a distance. This is not failure. It is a sign that the soul is waking up. When the inner world no longer matches the outer performance, a man is invited to begin a deeper kind of work. This work begins with disillusionment. To see the mask for what it is painful. It means acknowledging that parts of your life have been lived not from authenticity, but from adaptation. It means recognizing that some of your most celebrated traits may be defensive structures. Charm masking fear, strength concealing vulnerability, success covering shame. These realizations can bring sorrow, even a crisis of identity, but they are necessary if a man is to come into contact with the truth of who he is. The truth is often quieter than the persona. It may not be as polished. It may not please everyone, but it is real, and in time it brings peace. The man who detaches from his persona does not become socially isolated or indifferent. Rather, he becomes congruent. His inner life and outer expression begin to align. He speaks with clarity because he no longer speaks only to be liked. He acts with integrity because he no longer needs to prove himself. He begins to live from the inside out, not the outside in. Detaching from the persona also requires solitude. When you are constantly performing for others, it becomes impossible to hear your own voice. Time alone is not a withdrawal, it is a return. In the silence, the true self begins to emerge, not with grand declarations, but with quiet recognitions. This is what I love, this is what I believe, this is what I need. Often, what surfaces surprises us. The man who played the stoic may discover a deep sensitivity. The man who lived as a provider may feel called to create, to wander, to teach, to rest. These discoveries are not regressions, they are reclamations. The fear, of course, is that letting go of the persona means losing respect, power, or belonging. But the opposite is true. The man who dares to step out from behind his mask inspires others to do the same. His authenticity becomes magnetic, not because he tries to be admirable, but because he dares to be whole. He no longer compartmentalizes his life into performance and privacy. He lives with a kind of wholeness that cannot be faked. This does not mean all parts of the persona must be discarded. Some elements are genuine reflections of values and strengths, but now they are chosen consciously, not clung to unconsciously. The man can still be a leader, a father, a professional, but he knows these are roles, not definition. He wears them like well-fitting clothes, not like armor. The journey of detaching from the persona is not linear. There will be times when the old mask feels necessary, even comforting, and that's all right. The goal is not perfection, but awareness. Each time you catch yourself slipping into performance, you have an opportunity to return, not to who you should be, but to who you are. And in doing so, you begin to discover that the self behind the mask is not weak or inadequate. It is simply waiting to be seen. There comes a point in a man's life when he can no longer outrun time. The years pass more quickly, and the mirror no longer flatters. He begins to attend more funerals than weddings. His strength remains, but it no longer disguises the quiet toll being exacted each day. He becomes aware, often suddenly, of something he had long buried beneath ambition, distraction, and effort. The undeniable truth that his time is finite. This confrontation with mortality is not morbid, it is sacred, for it is only in facing death that a man learns how to live. Most of life is spent unconsciously denying death. The modern world is structured around keeping it hidden. Death is outsourced to hospitals, sanitized, postponed. Men are taught to build, to accumulate, to conquer, as if these achievements could insulate them from the end. But no amount of wealth, strength, or success alters the fundamental truth. Everything that begins must end. The ego resists this knowledge. It clings to illusions of permanence, but the soul knows better. The soul does not fear death. It fears unlived life. To make peace with mortality is to awaken. It is to turn inward and ask, if I were to die tomorrow, what would remain unfinished? Not in my tasks, but in my being. What words have I withheld? What part of myself have I buried beneath duty or fear? What dreams have I abandoned, not because they were impossible, but because I was afraid of the cost? These questions cannot be answered by intellect alone. They must be felt. They require solitude, honesty, and often grief. Grieving is not reserved only for loss of others. A man must also grieve the versions of himself he will never become, paths not taken, choices made too late, innocence that cannot return. This grief is not weakness, it is maturity. It softens arrogance and invites humility. It teaches that regret is not an enemy, but a teacher. To feel regret is to recognize the value of time. It is to realize that every moment wasted in distraction, resentment, or pride is a moment stolen from what could have been presence. In the depth of this reckoning, something remarkable can occur. The fear of death begins to loosen its grip. When a man looks at death not as a distant abstraction, but as an intimate companion, his priorities shift. He no longer seeks to impress, to dominate, or to win for its own sake. He seeks to be. He seeks to connect, to create, to serve, to express. He understands that the purpose of life is not to avoid death, but to use life fully before death arrives. And that fullness is not measured in years, but in depth. Death also demands that we examine what we are leaving behind, not in terms of legacy carved in stone or remembered in grand speeches, but in quieter forms. What memory will your child hold when they think of your presence? What words of yours will echo in the heart of a friend long after you're gone? What value, what integrity, what courage did you demonstrate not when it was convenient, but when it was hard? These are the true markers of a life lived in awareness of its limit. To live with mortality in view is not to walk in despair, it is to walk with reverence. You begin to see each sunrise as something sacred, each encounter as something finite, each breath as something unearned. Gratitude grows not from luxury, but from impermanence. The man who knows he will die holds his loved ones more closely. He listens more deeply. He wastes less time on petty grievances. He apologizes faster, loves more openly, and becomes less concerned with appearing strong and more committed to being real. There is a paradox in this truth. The closer a man comes to accepting his death, the more fully alive he becomes. He no longer treats time as if it were endless. He begins to taste his days. He invests his attention where it matters. He no longer needs to prove his worth because he knows that worth is not in comparison but in embodiment. He does not need the world to validate him because his relationship with death has taught him that validation is fleeting. What matters is whether he has been true to himself. This relationship with mortality also changes how one views others. When you see every person as someone who will die, you begin to soften. You begin to understand that beneath anger, pride, or cruelty lies fear, sorrow, and longing. You begin to forgive, not because it excuses pain, but because time is too precious to carry bitterness. You see the vulnerability in others because you have faced your own. To make peace with mortality is not to solve the mystery of death. It is to bow to it, to recognize it as the great equalizer, the final initiator, the one truth we all share. It strips away pretense. It reveals what endures, not the title, not the possession, not the mask, but the essence, the soul, the love. What remains is what was real. A man who lives with death beside him lives differently. He is not perfect, but he is awake. He does not waste time chasing immortality in the form of reputation or control. He seeks instead to live meaningfully, to make contact with the eternal, not by denying death, but by honoring the miracle of life itself, fragile, fleeting, and infinitely profound. Within every man resides a quiet presence, often neglected, sometimes feared, and rarely understood. It is not weakness, nor softness, nor sentimentality. It is the feminine within. This inner aspect is not about gender or sexuality, but about wholeness. The human psyche is not singular in its structure. It is a dance of opposites, a union of the masculine and the feminine, the rational and the intuitive, the active and the receptive. To reject any part of this inner landscape is to remain divided, and a divided man cannot be whole. From the earliest days of life, boys are taught what it means to be a man. They are told to be strong, stoic, decisive, and competitive. They are praised for logic and power, for action and independence. But rarely are they encouraged to cultivate the qualities traditionally associated with the feminine: empathy, intuition, creativity, vulnerability, nurturing, and emotional depth. And so, slowly, a schism forms within. The feminine is exiled to the unconscious. It does not vanish, it waits, and when it is denied for too long, it does not remain silent. It surfaces in distorted forms: emotional repression, disconnection, projection, even violence. To embrace the feminine within is not to become less masculine, it is to become more human. The man who fears his own softness becomes brittle. He postures, he overcompensates, he seeks dominance to hide his own helplessness. He ridicules what he cannot understand, especially within himself. But the man who begins to welcome the feminine begins to deepen. He is no longer ruled by rigid roles. He does not collapse under the weight of emotion, because he has learned to feel. He does not fear intimacy, because he has cultivated the capacity to connect. The feminine within every man often appears in dreams, art, and relationships. She may show up as an image, a figure, a longing. In Jungian terms, she is the anima, the inner soul image, the guide to the unconscious. She may first appear as mysterious, seductive, even disruptive, because the ego does not know what to do with her. But she is not here to destroy, she is here to reveal. She offers access to the inner world, the world of feeling, meaning, and imagination. Without her, the man becomes a stranger to his own depths. Many men try to access the feminine only through women. They project their own denied qualities onto partners, expecting them to carry the burden of emotional intelligence, sensitivity, and compassion. This projection inevitably leads to disappointment, conflict, and dependency. But when a man reclaims his own feminine qualities, he stops asking others to complete him. He meets women not as rescuers or mirrors, but as equals, as fellow travelers. He no longer fears being seen, because he has learned to see himself. The feminine is also the creative force, not the kind of creation that conquers or builds, but the kind that gestates, nourishes, and brings forth life from within. The man who embraces the feminine becomes capable of creating not just things, but meaning. He writes, paints, teaches, parents, listens, not to impress, but to give form to something authentic. He becomes a vessel for the deeper currents of the soul. He learns to wait, to surrender, to trust something beyond control. In doing so, he discovers that power is not only force, it is also receptivity. To embrace the feminine is also to make peace with vulnerability. The man who does not allow himself to be vulnerable is not invulnerable. He is simply armored, disconnected. Real strength is not found in denial, but in integration. The man who can sit with grief, who can speak from the heart, who can hold uncertainty without fleeing into distraction, that man is grounded. He is not easily shaken because he does not fear his own depths. He has descended into the underworld of feeling and returned with wisdom. There is a fear, often unconscious, that to embrace the feminine is to lose control, to dissolve, to become passive. But the feminine does not erase the masculine, it balances it. It softens rigidity, tempers aggression, and teaches the value of being overdoing. The masculine is linear, goal-driven, outward. The feminine is cyclical, intuitive, inward. Life requires both. The seasons, the tides, the breath itself, all follow the rhythm of duality. To live only from one pole is to resist life's natural order. The modern world, with its obsession with progress and dominance, often shames the feminine. Emotional expression is labeled weakness, rest is equated with laziness, sensitivity is mocked, but in truth these feminine qualities are not only vital, they are medicine. In a culture of burnout, numbness, and competition, the return of the feminine is not a regression. It is a healing, and that healing begins within the individual, one man at a time, turning inward, learning to feel, to listen, to hold. When a man embraces the feminine within, he becomes more present. He learns to notice, to hear what is not said, to feel into the space between words. He no longer rushes to fix everything. He becomes capable of simply being with others, and with himself. He becomes a father who holds his children not only with strength, but with tenderness. A partner who does not dominate but dances, a leader who does not command but inspires. This is not softness for its own sake. It is the courage to be whole, to bring together what has long been divided. The heart and the mind, the body and the soul, the doing and the being, the masculine and the feminine, in that union a man becomes more than a role. He becomes a vessel for life in its full spectrum. Not perfect, not finished, but real. The world applauds achievement. From the first steps of youth, we are conditioned to pursue visible victories, grades, titles, promotions, wealth. Society builds a ladder and tells the man to climb. Each rung promises significance: the job, the home, the family, the retirement plan. These goals are not inherently wrong. They provide structure, motivation, and purpose. But something strange begins to happen once the summit is reached. The man who has succeeded outwardly often finds himself restless inwardly. The applause grows faint, the trophies gather dust, the accolades no longer satisfy, and then a quiet question emerges from the depths. Is this all? This question does not arise in the noise. It surfaces in stillness, in moments of solitude, in the silence after achievement, in the spaces between action. It is not a crisis of failure, but of fulfillment. Success has been attained, but meaning has not. The man begins to sense a gap between what he does and who he is. He may try to fill the space with more status, more distractions, more goals, but the hunger remains. It is not for more, it is for deeper. The pursuit of success is largely governed by the ego. The ego seeks recognition, certainty, control. It defines identity through comparison. To succeed in this frame is to surpass others. It is to accumulate evidence of worth, but the soul is not interested in comparison. The soul seeks meaning. It does not care how high the ladder reaches. It wants to know whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. When success is severed from meaning, it becomes hollow. When the ego leads without the soul, life becomes a performance rather than a participation in something true. Meaning is not something given. It must be discovered, uncovered, often wrestled from the depths of discomfort. It is not necessarily found in the extraordinary, but in the genuine, in the honest work, in the sacredness of relationship, in service, in the encounter with the self. It does not always align with what others admire. In fact, the pursuit of meaning often requires leaving behind the very paths that brought success. This is the tension many men face at midlife. The life they built no longer speaks to the life they long for. To seek meaning requires courage. It means asking difficult questions. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Who am I serving? What do I truly value? Where have I abandoned myself to fit in or be praised? These questions are not abstract. They are surgical. They cut through illusion and expose what is real. Often, they reveal that a life built solely on ambition may lack intimacy, authenticity, and connection. The man may realize that his outer victories have come at the cost of his inner voice. But this realization is not a failure. It is an awakening. It is the first step toward reclaiming a life of substance. When a man turns toward meaning, his relationship with success changes. He no longer defines success by numbers or status, but by alignment. Success becomes a byproduct of purpose, not a substitute for it. He begins to ask not only, what do I want to achieve, but also, what is worth my time, my energy, my life? Meaning has no universal formula. It is deeply personal. For one man, it may be found in craftsmanship, in making something with care and precision. For another, it may emerge through fatherhood, through creating space for others to thrive. For some, it arises in the act of healing, teaching, writing, growing, listening. It is less about what one does and more about how one does it, whether it comes from the core or from the mask. To live meaningfully, a man must slow down. He must listen, not just to the noise of the world, but to the quiet voice within. That voice is often small, subtle, easily drowned out by urgency and distraction, but it speaks truth. It does not flatter. It does not rush. It reminds the man of who he was before he was told who to be. It guides him toward integration, where his outer actions mirror his inner values. There is a grief in this journey. The man must let go of the identity he worked so hard to build. He may lose approval. He may be misunderstood. He may have to step away from structures that no longer support his soul. But what he gains is far greater, a sense of inner congruence, a clarity of purpose, a connection to life that is not dependent on external validation. In seeking meaning, the man becomes a servant, not of ego, but of essence. He no longer needs to conquer because he understands that true power is found in presence. He becomes less concerned with legacy and more committed to impact. He asks not what will they say about me, but what difference did I make in the lives I touched? He begins to orient his life toward depth over breadth, quality over quantity, being over appearing. This does not mean abandoning ambition. It means anchoring ambition in something deeper. When ambition is married to meaning, it becomes a force for transformation. The man becomes generative. His work does not drain him, it energizes him. His presence uplifts, not because he tries to impress, but because he embodies something real. To seek meaning is to return to the inner world, to descend into the soul's quiet domain and ask, what do I know to be true? It is to live from the inside out, not the outside in. And in that return, the man does not become less successful. He becomes fulfilled. He becomes whole. There comes a time when a man can no longer live on borrowed meanings. The words of teachers, the values of society, the expectations of family, even the image of himself that he once held so firmly, all begin to lose their hold. The life he built may look successful from the outside, even admirable, yet deep within, something stirs and unsettles. A quiet, insistent voice asks, is this truly who I am? That question is not a rebellion, it is a summons. It is the beginning of the long and sacred journey toward individuation. Individuation is not the pursuit of self-improvement, nor is it the accumulation of knowledge, status, or spiritual credentials. It is the slow, often painful, unfolding of the true self, not the self one was taught to perform, but the deeper essence that has always existed beneath the surface. It is the process of becoming who one truly is, whole, integrated, authentic. The man who embarks on this path does not become perfect, he becomes real, and in a world obsessed with surfaces, reality has become a radical act. The journey begins when a man becomes aware of the masks he wears. These masks, what Jung called the persona, serve a purpose. They allow him to function, to relate, to belong. But over time, the man forgets that the mask is not his face. He identifies with his role, his reputation, his social face. He begins to believe that he is only what others see. Individuation begins when he dares to look behind the mask, not with shame, but with curiosity. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I feel, believe, or long for when I am not performing? To individuate is to risk disapproval. The man who walks this path often finds himself misunderstood, even by those closest to him. As he sheds inherited beliefs, false obligations, and internalized ideals, others may accuse him of changing, but he is not changing, he is emerging. The person he once presented to the world was a construction, useful but limited. The self that now rises is rooted not in imitation but in inner truth. He is not rebelling against others, he is returning to himself. The path of individuation is not linear, it involves descent into the unconscious, into shadow, into forgotten memories and unhealed wounds. The man must confront the parts of himself he has long denied. He must face the anger he repressed, the fears he masked with strength, the grief he refused to feel. He does not do this to become consumed by darkness, but to integrate it. For what is not integrated controls him from the shadows. What is hidden becomes projected onto others, distorting perception and creating conflict. Individuation brings these parts home, not to glorify them, but to transform them through awareness. This inner integration requires solitude, not isolation, but solitude of the soul, a withdrawal from noise, from distraction, from the constant need to react and respond. In solitude, the man listens. He begins to distinguish between the voice of the ego and the voice of the deeper self. He becomes familiar with his inner symbols, dreams, images, intuitions, that guide him more surely than any outer map. He learns that the self is not found in ambition but in alignment. Individuation is not narcissism. It does not make a man self-absorbed, but self-responsible. He no longer blames the world for his suffering. He understands that much of his pain came not from life itself, but from the lies he told himself to survive. As he becomes more conscious, he becomes more compassionate. He does not need to dominate others because he has nothing left to prove. His strength is no longer defensive, it is generative. He becomes a center not of control, but of presence. This journey also brings the man into a different relationship with archetypes, the deep patterns of the human psyche. He begins to recognize the warrior not just as aggression, but as inner discipline, the lover not as seduction, but as the capacity to feel deeply, the king not as ruler of others, but as one who governs himself with integrity, the magician not as a manipulator, but as a bringer of insight. He sees these energies not as roles to play, but as aspects of himself to balance and harmonize. As the man individuates, his definition of success changes. He is no longer interested in being impressive, he is interested in being whole. He values authenticity over approval, depth over performance, connection over control. He may still work, create, lead, but his work comes from a different place. He is not seeking completion through what he does. He is expressing what is already complete within him. His life becomes a manifestation of his essence, not a compensation for its absence. Individuation also brings him into a deeper relationship with others. He no longer demands that they fulfill his unmet needs or reflect back a flattering image. He allows others to be who they are because he is at peace with who he is. He can listen without needing to fix. He can love without needing to possess. His relationships become not arenas of power, but spaces of presence. He no longer clings because he is rooted in himself. There is no end point to individuation. It is not a state to be achieved, but a path to be walked. It continues until the last breath, and yet every step brings a deeper sense of meaning, of alignment, of inner peace. The man who lives in pursuit of individuation becomes more grounded, more alive, more attuned to the sacred mystery that pulses beneath the surface of ordinary life. He does not live without fear, but he lives beyond it. He does not seek to escape suffering, but to find wisdom within it. He does not strive to be extraordinary, but to be true. And in doing so, he discovers that the most profound journey is not toward some distant goal, but toward the forgotten center of his own soul.